艾玛 Emma 是《傲慢与偏见》的作者简奥斯汀 Jane Austen 的另一篇长篇小说。艾玛是个上流社会的富家女，在她的村庄海伯里举足轻重。她善良、热心自负。文章描述了当时英国社会的爱情婚姻。该作品被多次搬上荧幕。
Chapter 11 Harriet is in love again. The next morning, Emma thought about the ball as she walked in the garden at Hartfield. She decided that it had gone well. She had enjoyed dancing with Mr. Knightley, and she was pleased that he had danced with Harriet. Emma had decided that Frank Churchill was not in love with her. Or perhaps he did love her, but only a little. The summer would be a happy and interesting time. Emma turned to walk back into the house and saw two people coming towards her, Harriet and Mr. Frank Churchill. Harriet was crying and holding Mr. Churchill's arm. Emma took them into the house and made Harriet sit down. And then the poor girl fainted. Frank Churchill quickly explained what had happened. Harriet and another pupil from Mrs. Goddard's school had been walking along a quiet little road. They had met a group of gypsies who started asking the girls for money. The other girl was very frightened. She screamed and ran away. But Harriet was too tired after the ball. She did not run. The gypsies were soon all around her. They shouted at her and asked for money. Harriet gave them a coin, but they wanted more, and poor Harriet became very frightened. At that moment, Frank Churchill came along the road and saw everything. He was carrying a stick, and very soon the gypsies were as frightened as Harriet had been. They ran away, and Frank had brought Harriet to Hartfield. Frank Churchill could not stay after Emma had heard the story. He had to return to the Churchills in Richmond. Harriet spent the day at Hartfield with Emma and was soon feeling much better. What an adventure for Harriet Smith! She had been badly frightened and then rescued by handsome Frank Churchill. Emma did not want her father to hear the story, but soon everyone in Highbury, including her father, knew about it. Harriet was not hurt, only frightened. Emma began to think about Harriet and Mr. Frank Churchill. Was it possible that they could love each other? Would they be a good match for each other? A few days later, Harriet returned to Hartfield. She had a little parcel in her hand. "Miss Woodhouse, if you have time, I have something to tell you," Harriet said. "I have been very silly. I want to tell you everything." Emma was very surprised, and she asked Harriet to go on. "I do not care if I meet Mr. Elton or not," Harriet said. "I wanted to tell you that. And I think that Mrs. Elton is very bad-tempered. I do not like her at all. I have been very silly, Miss Woodhouse, but my feelings have changed. I want to show you that I no longer love Mr. Elton. Look." Harriet slowly untied the parcel. Inside the paper there was a little box. Harriet lifted the lid of the box. Emma looked inside it and was surprised. "All I can see is a piece of plaster and the end of an old pencil," Emma said slowly. "What have they to do with Mr. Elton, Harriet?" "Surely you remember, Miss Woodhouse," Harriet said. "One day Mr. Elton cut his finger, and I gave him some plaster. There was a little piece of the plaster which he did not use. He held the piece in his hand for a time, and here it is. This was his pencil, but it was too small, and he threw it away. Later on, I picked it up and kept it. Look, Miss Woodhouse, I am going to throw the pencil and the plaster onto the fire. There, she said, throwing them into the flames. That is the end of my love for Mr. Elton. I shall never marry now, Harriet added. The man whom I love will never know my feelings. I admire him so much, but he will never know. I shall never tell him of my love. Tell him? Tell who, Harriet? Emma cried. Who are you talking about? She was becoming tired of this word game. As soon as I saw him coming towards me, I knew, Harriet began. He is a real gentleman. He was so kind to me. I shall never forget it. My feelings have changed so quickly, but they will never change again, Miss Woodhouse, never. However, when Emma asked Harriet the gentleman's name, her friend only shook her head and smiled. She would not answer. I think that I understand, Emma said with a kind smile. But I shall not give you any advice this time. Do what you feel is right, my dear Harriet. You have made a good choice. It was now June. Jane Fairfax was still in Highbury, and she was planning to stay for another 2 months. Mr. Frank Churchill was often at Randalls, and everyone liked the young man. Everyone except Mr. Knightley. Most people in Highbury thought that there would be a match between Frank Churchill and Emma Woodhouse. But Emma herself hoped that Frank was falling in love with Harriet, and she thought that Harriet was in love with Frank Churchill. Mr. Knightley had a different thought. He believed that Frank and Jane were more than friends. Mr. Knightley had seen Frank Churchill looking at Jane Fairfax. He thought that Frank Churchill had a secret. One warm evening, Mr. Knightley was walking with Emma and Harriet in the main street of Highbury. They saw Mr. and Mrs. Weston and Frank Churchill, who had met Miss Bates and Jane. Emma invited all her friends to come to Hartfield for tea with herself and Mr. Woodhouse. My father would be delighted to see you all, Emma said. A meeting of good friends in his own house is just the kind of surprise that he likes. They all agreed to come to Emma's home. As they walked towards the gates of Hartfield, Dr. Perry rode by on his horse. Frank looked surprised. Did you not tell me that Dr. Perry was buying his own carriage? He said to Mrs. Weston. No, I did not, Mrs. Weston said. But you told me so in one of your letters, Frank said. Mrs. Perry told her husband that they should buy more horses and a carriage. Do you not remember? I have never heard of it before. Frank laughed. I must have dreamt it then, he said. I am always dreaming of Highbury when I am away. But why should I dream about Dr. Perry? Oh dear, Miss Bates cried. I think that I can explain. It was not a dream at all, Mr. Churchill. Dr. Perry did plan to buy a carriage in the spring, but it was a secret. Mrs. Perry told my mother, and my mother told us. Do you not remember, Jane? Jane Fairfax was at the back of the group, and did not hear her aunt's question. Oh, well, perhaps I told someone else, Miss Bates went on. I do talk a lot, I know. I must have told someone about the carriage. Mr. Knightley looked at Frank. The young man had heard Miss Bates's words. Now Frank was looking at Jane and trying not to laugh. Jane did not notice that Frank was looking at her. She walked on into the house. The visitors were soon sitting at the large dining table at Hartfield and drinking tea. Frank sat down next to Emma. Frank picked up a little wooden box that was on the table and opened it. The box belonged to Emma's young nephews. Inside it, there were letters of the alphabet, which were made of wood. "Let us play a word game with these letters," Frank said to Emma. As he spoke, Frank took a few letters from the box and put them on the table. Then he made a word and pushed the letters across the table towards Jane Fairfax. Jane soon guessed the word, but she pushed the letters away again. Harriet picked them up and tried to make the word with Mr. Knightley's help. "Mistake," Harriet cried. "The word is mistake." Frank laughed, but Jane blushed and shook her head. Mr. Knightley did not know what to think. Was Frank laughing at Jane and at Emma too? Frank pushed another 5 letters towards Emma and smiled. She quickly made them into a word and then moved the letters about again. "Shall I ask Jane to make this word?" Frank said quietly to Emma. "No, no, you must not," Emma replied. But Frank had already pushed the 5 letters towards Jane. Mr. Knightley saw that the letters made the name Dixon. Jane looked very unhappy. "People's names cannot be used in the game, Mr. Churchill," she said. Then she turned towards Miss Bates and spoke to her quietly. Miss Bates stood up. "Yes, my dear Jane, you are right," she said. "It is time to go." Jane stood up too and put on her shawl. Frank pushed some more letters towards Jane, but she turned away. Mr. Knightley did not see if Frank spoke to her or not. Mr. Knightley stayed on at Hartfield when the others had all gone home. "A strange game was played here tonight," he said to Emma. "I was watching Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill. There is a secret between them, I am sure. I think that they are more than friends." Emma laughed and shook her head. "A match between Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill? No, you are wrong, very wrong, Mr. Knightley," Emma said. "I do not think that Jane likes Frank at all, and I am sure that he does not admire her." Mr. Knightley was not pleased by Emma's words, and he left Hartfield soon afterwards.